During the 17th and 18th centuries, the Caribbean became the stage for a real story so intense that it gave rise to immortal myths, the era of the true pirates of the Caribbean. Legendary figures sailed its waters, such as Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, who with his beard set ablaze with sulphur terrorized any crew, Henry Morgan, the Welsh privateer who plundered Panama and ended up as governor of Jamaica, or Anne Bonny and Mary Read, two women who defied the norms of their time and fought with the same ferocity as any man. Around them, legends of hidden treasures, secret maps, and curses were born, which still fuel popular imagination today. It is said that Blackbeard's loot was never found, that Morgan's chests of gold lie beneath the sands of the Honduran coast, and that the Spanish galleons sunk off the Bahamas still hold incalculable riches. The Caribbean after the discovery of America. The arrival of Christopher Columbus in the Caribbean islands in 1492 marked a turning point in world history. From the moment the Spanish expedition landed in Guanahani, the Caribbean Sea ceased to be an unknown extension of the Atlantic Ocean and became the logistical and strategic center of the largest transoceanic empire of its time. The small islands inhabited by Taino and Carib communities were suddenly transformed into key pieces within an imperial network intended to extract resources, control maritime routes, and ensure the political and religious dominance of the Spanish crown over the New World. The arrival of Europeans not only brought colonization, but also the need to establish a system that protected the constant flow of wealth to the Iberian Peninsula. The Caribbean became the starting point of this enterprise. During the first voyage, Columbus identified a strategic position in the Caribbean islands due to their geographic location. They served as a natural stopover between Europe and the newly discovered continent. In his subsequent expeditions, he founded settlements such as La Navidad in Hispaniola and later Isabela, with the aim of establishing a permanent presence that allowed for interior exploration and the organization of gold extraction. Hispaniola became the first administrative center of the Spanish Empire in America, followed shortly after by Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica. From these points, the Spanish began mapping the Caribbean, tracing navigation routes that connected the islands to each other and linked the archipelago with the mainland and the Atlantic ports of Seville and Cadiz. The discovery of gold in the rivers and mountains of Hispaniola generated a wealth fever that attracted settlers, soldiers, and royal officials. The first mines began to operate on a large scale, forcing the crown to establish a bureaucratic apparatus to record the royal fifth, the tax that required 20% of all extracted metal to be delivered to the royal treasury. Every ship leaving the Caribbean was carefully inspected and required to declare all cargo. However, the greed of settlers and officials led to the emergence of parallel smuggling networks, in which part of the gold was hidden and sent through clandestine routes. These illegal activities caught the attention of French and English sailors who understood that control of the sea meant control of wealth. The Caribbean Sea began to fill with Spanish vessels transporting gold and supplies between the islands. The first colonial cities, such as Santo Domingo and San Juan, became ports from which ships sailed to the peninsula. These cities were soon fortified with walls and cannons as rumors of enemy raids began to circulate a few years after the discovery. France, which did not accept the territorial concessions granted by Pope Alexander VI in favor of Spain and Portugal, sent Breton sailors to explore the Caribbean, officially to trade, but in practice to intercept shipments of gold and indigenous slaves. The establishment of the fleet system at the beginning of the 16th century was a direct response to these threats. Spain organized its maritime routes rigorously. Each year, on determined dates, a complete fleet departed from the port of Seville, crossed the Atlantic in convoy, and dispersed in different directions upon reaching the Caribbean. On the way back, the ships gathered in Havana to cross the ocean together, protected by warships. This measure was necessary, as tropical storms could scatter the ships and enemy attacks had become increasingly frequent. The Caribbean Sea had ceased to be a free space and had become a corridor controlled by Spanish military power. The growing flow of wealth transformed the perception of the Caribbean within Europe. Reports sent to Madrid spoke of gold mines, sugar plantations, livestock, and African slaves who were brought in massive numbers to replace the indigenous population, devastated by disease and forced labor. Each ship that arrived in Spain with gold or silver reinforced the power of the Spanish Empire, but also increased the resentment of other powers. England, which was going through a period of monarchical consolidation under Henry VIII and later Elizabeth I, began to watch with concern as its continental rival enriched itself without opposition. The religious rivalry between Catholics and Protestants moved to the sea, and the Caribbean became the main stage of that struggle for supremacy. Spanish trade routes passed through shallow waters, uninhabited islands, and difficult-to-navigate straits, which forced galleons to follow predictable paths. This gave enemies an advantage. It was enough to know the winds and currents to intercept the fleets on their way back to Europe. France initiated the first organized attacks against Spanish ships in the 1520s, while England began financing private expeditions in the mid-16th century. The Caribbean became a sea watched by invisible enemies, where ships had to sail in tight formation and under constant alert. Spanish chronicles of the time report clashes in waters near Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Bahamas, where attackers disappeared after seizing the loot. The growth of smuggling also weakened the Spanish monopoly. Spanish colonists began to trade clandestinely with the French and English, delivering cattle, hides, and sugar in exchange for European products cheaper than those sent from Seville. This not only undermined imperial authority, but allowed rival powers to establish intelligence networks within the Caribbean. Every Spanish port became a lookout point for enemies, who studied its defenses, routes, and departure times. The Caribbean Sea, which at the beginning of the 16th century was an almost exclusive Spanish sea, quickly transformed into a multilateral space where legal merchants, illegal privateers, desperate colonists, and kingdoms in direct competition for oceanic supremacy converged. With the expansion to the continent, especially after the discovery of Mexico by Hernán Cortés in 1519 and Peru by Francisco Pizarro in 1532, the Caribbean consolidated as the connection point between continental riches and European ports. Everything had to pass through that sea. The routes from Veracruz, Cartagena de Indias, and even Portobello converged in Havana, forming a vital artery for the empire. But that same predictability turned the Caribbean into the preferred stage for the emergence of a new class of enemy who did not fight for the glory of a nation, but for the direct capture of the gold that ran among the waves of the Western Atlantic. Piracy is born, the first attacks on the Spanish Empire. At the beginning of the 16th century, while the Spanish Empire was consolidating its dominance over the Caribbean and establishing the first permanent cities in Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, alarming reports began to emerge about foreign ships patrolling the sea routes. The first official mentions of pirate attacks date back to 1523, when vessels from France were sighted near the coasts of the Antilles, intercepting galleons loaded with gold from Caribbean mines. These men, lacking uniforms and acting without legal authorization, struck quickly and vanished into the waters without a trace. They answered to no authority other than their own ambition. Spain called these aggressors Lutherans, not only because of their French origin, but because they represented a heretical challenge to the Catholic and monarchical order that Spain sought to impose in the New World. The French pirates, particularly those from Normandy and Brittany, were the first systematic maritime enemies of the Spanish monopoly. They exploited knowledge of the trade winds and positioned themselves strategically at natural entrances to the Caribbean, waiting for ships returning to Seville. Colonial chronicles recount how small vessels, called pinnaces and filiboats, would swoop down on the slower Spanish ships of the fleet, forcing them to surrender under threat of death. Unlike legitimate privateers, these pirates carried no letter of marque and were therefore considered enemies of all nations. Nevertheless, their attacks aligned with France's political interests, which not only tolerated their existence but in some cases supplied them with weapons and provisions. One of the first documented attacks occurred off the island of San Juan in 1528, when a group of French pirates captured a ship loaded with gold destined for the crown. The loot was transported to clandestine ports on the Atlantic coast of France, where it was sold illegally in local markets. This incident alarmed the Casa de Contratación in Seville, which warned King Charles I about the growing threat in the Atlantic. The response was immediate. Spain ordered the construction of faster warships, the fortification of Havana, and the implementation of a convoy system. But these measures failed to deter the pirates, who did not need to face entire fleets to profit. but rather targeted isolated ships, always moving in the shadows. The rise of piracy was favored by the temporary weakening of the Spanish presence in the Caribbean. Many of its ships were deployed to support Charles V's continental campaigns against France and the Holy Roman Empire. This left the trade routes of the Antilles unprotected, which became the favorite target of pirates. Capturing ships was not their only goal. Some pirates began landing in ports and coastal towns, looting warehouses and taking prisoners. Indigenous villages and Spanish settlements were attacked in Hispaniola and Cuba, generating a constant sense of insecurity among the colonists. One of the most significant episodes occurred in 1537 when the French pirate François Leclerc, nicknamed Peg Leg due to a wooden prosthesis, led an expedition that plundered the city of Santiago de Cuba. His men set government buildings on fire, stole gold stored in the treasury, and demanded a ransom to avoid the city's total destruction. This attack marked a before and after in Caribbean history, as it demonstrated that even fortified settlements could fall to a well-organized pirate fleet. Spain responded by sending more troops and creating local militias, but the damage had already been done. The myth of Spanish invulnerability had been broken. Attacks on the Spanish Empire continued to increase during the 1540s and 1550s. The smaller Caribbean islands, such as Guadeloupe and Martinique, began to be used by pirates as resupply points. Although officially they belonged to the Spanish domain according to international treaties, in practice they were territories without a permanent military presence, allowing pirates to use them as temporary shelters. From there they repaired their ships, stored their loot, and planned new raids. The tropical jungle offered almost impenetrable natural hideouts, while reefs and cays protected pirates from large Spanish galleons, which had too deep a draft to navigate shallow waters. The pirate phenomenon acquired a new dimension when some English sailors began to imitate the French. England, embroiled in its own process of breaking with the Catholic Church and rivalry with Spain, tacitly allowed its sailors to attack Spanish ships even though there was no declared war yet. English pirates began operating in the Bahamas and the Yucatan Channel, destroying fisheries, stealing indigenous slaves, and seizing gold cargoes. These early attacks did not yet have the explicit backing of the English crown, but they laid the groundwork for the subsequent transformation of piracy into a political weapon. As the attacks intensified, the Caribbean Sea became an unofficial war zone. Spanish authorities began issuing secret reports describing the Caribbean as an uneasy sea, infested with nameless enemies. The departures of galleons to Spain had to be constantly delayed due to the need for additional escorts. Colonists began building coastal watchtowers, while Spanish governors requested more cannons, more soldiers, and more ships. The Spanish Empire understood that the problem was not limited to mere sea bandits. A global conflict for the control of trade routes was brewing, in which pirates were only the vanguard of a deeper imperial assault. In 1559, Spanish authorities reported that pirate attacks had even reached the coasts of the Iberian Peninsula, with raids off Cadiz and Galicia. Pirates were no longer an exclusively American phenomenon, but part of an economic warfare system promoted in the shadows by rival powers. The first Caribbean pirates had been born not as legendary figures or romantic rebels, but as agents of geopolitical chaos, ready to plunder the treasures of the world's most powerful empire before they reached safe harbor. The emergence of privateers with royal patents. The transition from the 16th to the 17th century marked a decisive turn in the history of the Caribbean. Piracy ceased to be a clandestine phenomenon and became a strategic tool of the European crowns. Hostilities between Spain, England, and France had grown to the point that attacking maritime trade was considered a legitimate way to weaken the enemy without the need to declare a formal war. In this context, privateers emerged, sailors who operated with a letter of marque granted by their respective monarch, which allowed them to capture and plunder enemy ships in the name of the crown. This new figure differed from the common pirate not in its methods but in its legal status. Their actions were backed by an official document that turned robbery into a patriotic act and the loot into tax revenue. England was the first kingdom to understand the potential of this tactic. During the reign of Elizabeth I, rivalry with Spain reached critical levels. The Protestant Reformation had fractured the religious balance in Europe, and the American wealth arriving in Seville financed Philip II's armies. Faced with this threat, the English monarchy decided to respond not with a land army, but with a war of privateering. The Queen began issuing secret patents to experienced captains, authorizing them to capture Spanish ships. These documents stipulated that a portion of the loot would be delivered to the Crown, while the rest would be shared among the captain and his crew. Thus emerged figures such as John Hawkins and Francis Drake, who became the first renowned English privateers. Francis Drake carried out his first incursion into the Caribbean in 1572 with the goal of attacking the Spanish ports from which treasures departed. He landed in Nombre de Dios on the coast of the Isthmus of Panama, and although he did not manage to capture the gold directly, he discovered the existence of the pack mules transporting silver from the interior of the continent to the Caribbean. Drake organized ambushes on the roads, intercepting land caravans, a method no previous pirate had used. His operations demonstrated that control of the Caribbean depended not only on the sea, but also on the land routes that supplied the ports. In 1573, he managed to steal part of the treasure on the so-called Camino Real de Cruces, later returning to England, where he was received as a national hero. France, for its part, had been a pioneer in the use of privateers in the North Atlantic, especially in the region of Newfoundland and the English Channel. By the mid-16th century, it began applying it in the Caribbean, granting patents to sailors operating from the Lesser Antilles. Jacques de Sauras was one of the first French privateers to act under a royal patent. In 1555, he attacked and plundered Havana, seizing its treasures and burning the city. His attack demonstrated the vulnerability of the main Spanish strongholds and forced the Crown to build permanent fortifications in the most important Caribbean ports, marking the beginning of an arms race that would last for decades. Privateering patents not only legitimized plundering but also created a new economy based on loot. The ports of England and France became centers where goods captured in the Caribbean were sold. Port cities began to enrich themselves from the tributes paid by privateers, who in turn financed new expeditions. This legalized piracy allowed European kingdoms to challenge the Spanish trade monopoly without directly confronting its powerful navy. Privateers thus became instruments of a covert war financed through the appropriation of others' wealth. The emergence of privateers coincided with the gradual decline of Spanish naval power. By the late 16th century, Spain was exhausted by wars in Flanders and the struggle against the Ottoman Empire. The construction of the Invincible Armada to invade England in 1588 had drained the empire's treasury. When the invasion failed, many Spanish ships were destroyed or scattered. The loss of the Invincible Armada marked a turning point in Atlantic maritime control. English privateers took advantage of this weakness to intensify their attacks, capturing galleons and obtaining large amounts of gold and silver without facing significant resistance. In the Caribbean, privateering gave rise to a new social organization at sea. Crews elected their captains by vote and established equitable distribution of loot. Although they fought in the name of kings and queens, their daily life was governed by internal rules based on relative equality among crew members. This democratic structure was one of the most distinctive features of the privateering phenomenon and laid the foundations for the organization of future buccaneers. Privateers operated from hideouts on islands such as Barbados, Martinique, and Tortuga, where they could repair their ships and recruit new men. These enclaves became semi-independent communities that challenged the authority of European powers. The legality of privateering did not prevent privateers from being considered pirates by their enemies. For Spain, there was no difference between a pirate and a privateer. Both were raiders attacking its ships and cities. The Spanish government issued capture orders against figures such as Francis Drake and Jacques de Sauras, declaring that, if captured, they should be executed as criminals. However, European crowns continued to support them, providing refuge and legal protection in their ports. Piracy thus became a geopolitical conflict in which each attack was part of a larger strategy to weaken Spanish hegemony. The expansion of privateering attracted sailors from all social classes. Ruined nobles, landless peasants, artisans, runaway slaves, and stateless adventurers joined privateering crews hoping to obtain wealth they could not achieve by other means. Expeditions became bolder, attacking not only isolated ships but also fortified ports. In 1586, Francis Drake led an attack on Santo Domingo and Cartagena de Indias, temporarily capturing both cities and demanding ransoms in gold and silver to avoid their destruction. These blows showed that not even the most important centers of Spanish colonial power were safe. The rise of privateering was not a marginal phenomenon, but a direct result of a new world order in which the ocean had become the main economic battlefield. European powers understood that dominating the sea meant dominating trade, and dominating trade meant controlling the political future of the world. Under this understanding, privateers became strategic tools, financed by monarchs and protected by national laws, transforming the Caribbean into the most contested stage on the planet in the 17th century. The Spanish decline and the power vacuum in the Caribbean. At the beginning of the 17th century, the Spanish Empire faced structural wear that weakened its presence in the Caribbean. Constant wars in Europe against England, France, and the Netherlands drained the Crown's financial resources, forcing it to declare several bankruptcies throughout the century. The vast wealth from the Americas was no longer enough to sustain the Empire's military machinery, and much of the gold and silver sent from the New World was immediately used to pay debts to foreign bankers. Maritime defenses began to deteriorate, ships aged without being replaced, and colonial garrisons lacked sufficient soldiers. This military weakening was directly reflected in the Caribbean, where Spanish trade routes became vulnerable to foreign attacks. While Spain was losing power, England, France, and the Netherlands were consolidating their naval strength and colonial ambition. England had overcome the threat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 and emerged as the new maritime power of the Atlantic. France, after internal religious conflicts, unified its kingdom under Henry IV and established an expansionist policy based on transoceanic trade. The Netherlands, newly independent from Spain, became a top financial and naval center, with a merchant fleet outnumbering the Spanish one. These powers observed that the Caribbean was the weak point of the Spanish Empire, a strategic place where wealth was concentrated without adequate protection. The loss of territorial control was progressive. At the end of the 16th century, the Spanish dominated most of the Caribbean islands, but many remained uninhabited or with minimal presence. The Crown had prioritized the conquest of the continent, especially Mexico and Peru, neglecting the small Antillean islands. This allowed English, French, and Dutch settlers to establish themselves on islands such as Barbados, St. Kitts, Guadeloupe, and Martinique, founding plantations and fortified ports. The Spanish did not have the means to expel these foreign occupants, which meant a gradual loss of control of the Caribbean. The empire's economy also entered into crisis. American silver caused uncontrolled inflation in Europe, reducing the value of the metal and raising the prices of goods. Meanwhile, smuggling spread throughout the Caribbean. Spanish colonists began to trade clandestinely with the English and French, obtaining manufactured products at lower prices than those sent from Seville. This illegal trade further weakened Spanish authority, as it reduced the royal treasury's income and allowed rival powers to establish economic networks within Spanish territories. The Caribbean became a powerboard contested by multiple actors. As the Spanish presence declined, privateers began to occupy the maritime space with greater freedom. Uninhabited islands offered natural refuges, where ships were repaired, loot was stored, and new expeditions were organized. Islands like Tortuga, located north of Hispaniola, became pirate bases under the control of French sailors who operated without direct orders from the king but with the tacit approval of the French colonial authorities. The English did the same in the Bahamas, while the Dutch used Curaçao and Aruba as smuggling centers. The deterioration of the Spanish Armada was a determining factor. Throughout the first half of the 17th century, Spain lost numerous vessels due to storms, enemy attacks, and shipwrecks. The lack of resources prevented their replacement. The fleets of the Indies continued to sail to the Caribbean to collect the continent's wealth, but they increasingly had fewer escorts. Pirates, aware of this weakness, began intercepting ships at strategic points such as the Bahama Channel and the Windward Passage. The predictability of the routes and the decrease in naval protection made the Caribbean an ideal stage for systematic plundering. The political decline of the empire became evident after the death of Philip II in 1598. His successors lacked the same strategic vision and were unable to maintain control over the vast colonial domains. The 30 Years' War, which began in 1618, consumed the remaining resources of the monarchy, which was forced to withdraw troops from the Caribbean to send them to European fronts. This redistribution left Caribbean ports with minimal garrisons, allowing enemies to occupy key enclaves without significant resistance. The creation of private trading companies by England and the Netherlands formalized colonial expansion and turned the looting of Spanish wealth into a state enterprise. Spanish weakening was reflected not only at sea but also on land. Colonial cities began to suffer shortages of food, weapons, and ammunition. The sending of reinforcements from the peninsula became sporadic, and many coastal defenses were abandoned. In 1628, the Dutch privateer Piet Hein captured the Spanish silver fleet in Matanzas Bay, Cuba, seizing all the treasure heading to Seville. This devastating blow demonstrated to the world that the empire could no longer guarantee the safety of its maritime routes. Caribbean gold, instead of enriching Spain, began to finance its enemies. The Spanish reaction was limited. Although it tried to reinforce the fortifications of key ports such as Cartagena de Indias, San Juan in Puerto Rico, and Havana, it lacked the means to protect all the islands. Many were left abandoned or with only a symbolic presence. The Caribbean ceased to be an exclusively Spanish sea and became a territory shared among multiple powers. The empire's weakness opened a power vacuum quickly filled by pirates, privateers, and foreign settlers who established new forms of government based on the law of the sea and the distribution of loot. Spanish decline did not mean an immediate retreat, but a gradual transition toward a new order in which England, France, and the Netherlands would contest control of Atlantic trade. The Caribbean became the central stage of this imperial rivalry, a space where gold, silver, and sugar circulated alongside cannons and foreign flags, while pirates emerged as the direct beneficiaries of the collapse of the Spanish maritime monopoly. The birth of the buccaneers and privateers. In the mid-17th century, a new class of free men emerged in the Caribbean, independent of any empire, living outside the law on islands forgotten by European powers. They were the buccaneers, whose origin goes back to French hunters who settled in the western part of Hispaniola and on the island of Tortuga. The term buccaneer comes from the French boucan, which referred to an indigenous technique of smoking meat over wooden grills. These men, mostly fugitives, deserter soldiers, and landless adventurers, hunted wild cattle and sold cured meat to ships crossing the Caribbean. Although at first their activity was commercial, their isolation and constant clashes with Spanish authorities pushed them toward piracy. Spain considered their settlements illegal and repeatedly sent troops to expel them. Each attempt at expulsion strengthened buccaneer resistance and consolidated their identity as enemies of the empire. The buccaneers established their main base on the island of Tortuga, located northwest of Hispaniola. The island offered natural defense with steep cliffs and deep bays where ships could hide. There they formed self-governing communities without nobility or social hierarchy. Decisions were made collectively, and wealth was distributed fairly after each expedition. This social model, unprecedented in the colonial world, attracted English and Dutch sailors who had also been expelled by the Spanish. Tortuga became the first pirate center in the Caribbean, a place where men of different nationalities lived under the same code, attack Spanish power, and share the loot without any king's intervention. Over time, the buccaneers abandoned land hunting and ventured into the sea. They transformed small boats into fast ships capable of navigating shallow waters and escaping Spanish galleons. These boats, called sloops and pinnaces, could move quickly among the cays and reefs of the Caribbean. The buccaneers began intercepting merchant ships, capturing cargoes of sugar, tobacco, leather, and occasionally silver and gold. Lacking an official port to sell their loot, they made secret agreements with French and English merchants who came to the coasts of Tortuga to exchange weapons and gunpowder for stolen goods. This semi-clandestine trade network allowed the buccaneers to prosper and finance increasingly daring expeditions. The figure of the filibuster emerged as an evolution of the sea buccaneer. Unlike the buccaneer, who could combine hunting with piracy, the filibuster was exclusively a naval pirate. Its name comes from the Dutch vrijbuiter, which means free thief, a term adopted by the French as flibustier. Filibusters operated on ships specialized for combat, armed with light cannons and manned by experienced sailors. Their main objective was to capture Spanish galleons on the high seas. These attacks required discipline, organization, and sophisticated tactics, such as approaching with the wind in their favor, attacking from the stern to avoid the front cannons, and boarding using hooks and nets. Unlike the common pirate, the filibuster did not act on impulse but carefully planned their attacks. Spanish treasure routes became the main stage for their incursions. From the mouths of the Orinoco to the Yucatan Channel, filibusters established observation points to detect the passage of galleons. They used lookouts stationed on hilltops or trees who lit signal fires when spotting Spanish sails. In this way, filibuster ships could intercept their targets before they reached fortified ports. In some cases, filibusters did not attack directly at sea but disembarked on the coast and took cities from the mainland. One of the first attacks of this kind was the sack of the city of Campeche on the Yucatan Peninsula, carried out by French filibusters in 1633. The growth of buccaneering activities drew the attention of England and France, who saw them as a useful instrument to weaken Spain. Both kingdoms began granting letters of marque to these independent sailors, turning them into privateers under royal protection. However, buccaneers maintained their autonomous lifestyle, accepting the letter of marque only when it suited them. This ambiguity allowed them to move between legality and illegality, sometimes acting as official privateers and other times as pirates without a flag. Spanish colonial authorities faced a difficult enemy to combat, as one day they operated with royal authorization and the next disappeared into the forests of Tortuga or the swamps of Hispaniola. The pirate republics became a unique phenomenon in colonial history. They were communities without nobility or private property, where every crew member had the right to vote and claim loot. The relative equality on board the ships contrasted with the rigid European estate society. Captains were democratically elected and could be removed if they lost the crew's trust. These rules encouraged loyalty among pirates and increased the effectiveness of their actions. Life at sea was governed by strict codes that prohibited theft among comrades, established financial compensation for injuries, and severely punished cowardice in combat. The rise of Port Royal and Nassau, lawless paradises. In the mid-17th century, the Caribbean entered a new era dominated by two names that became synonymous with abundance, sin, and power: Port Royal and Nassau. While Spain tried to maintain its shaky dominance, England and France were consolidating their presence in the Antilles, encouraging privateers and buccaneers who, after decades of raids, needed a place to trade, repair their ships, and spend their fortunes. These places arose on islands that had previously been secondary but now became the true hearts of piracy. Port Royal in Jamaica and Nassau in the Bahamas became lawless republics where morality and authority dissolved among rum, gold, and the roar of cannons. When England seized Jamaica from Spain in 1655, the Caribbean Sea changed hands. The conquest, led by Admiral William Penn and General Robert Venables, was part of the so-called Western Design, Oliver Cromwell's ambitious plan to undermine Spanish power in the New World. Upon discovering that Jamaica offered deep bays, abundant timber, and a strategic position among treasure routes, the English transformed it into their main base of operations. At the southern tip of the island, on a sand spit dividing the lagoon from the open sea, a port called Port Royal was established. What began as a military settlement became, within a few years, the richest city in the Western Hemisphere. Port Royal grew in step with smuggling and piracy. The English governors quickly realized that the best defense against Spain was to allow privateers to attack its fleets. In exchange for attacks on the loot, the pirates received shelter, repairs, and markets where they could sell their plunder. The city filled with taverns, warehouses, and brothels, and its population, barely a few hundred inhabitants in the 1660s, exceeded 6,000 just 20 years later. The ratio of men to women was 10-1, and the sound of hammers in the shipyards mixed with the cries of dice players and the calls of rum vendors. Every day, ships arrived from Tortuga, Barbados, Martinique, or the Bahamas, bringing stolen goods and sailors seeking adventure. Taverns were the center of port life. Alliances were forged there. Loot was divided and crews were hired. The names of Henry Morgan, Christopher Mings, and Edward Mansvelt began to echo among the smoke and glasses. Morgan, of Welsh origin, arrived in Port Royal as a privateer with an English commission and quickly rose to become its most influential figure. Under his command, Jamaica's privateers launched spectacular campaigns against Spanish ports in Central America. Portobelo, Maracaibo, and Panama were looted between 1668 and 1671. Each expedition enriched the city, which became an emporium where Spanish gold was exchanged for European goods. London merchants began indirectly financing the raids, aware that Port Royal offered quicker profits than any agricultural colony. Wealth transformed the landscape. By the 1670s, Port Royal had cobbled streets, brick warehouses, Anglican churches, and two-story mansions facing the sea. The port could accommodate more than 200 vessels, and its slave market became one of the busiest in the Caribbean. However, prosperity came at a price. The city was known for its corruption and debauchery. English chroniclers described it as the Sodom of the New World. Governors tolerated vice because it fueled the economy. Taxes on rum and brothels financed fortifications and colonial administration. Each tavern had its own improvised notary who recorded crew contracts and loot division, turning anarchy into a system. The power of Port Royal was based on a complex trade network. Pirates brought to the city shipments of gold, silver, cocoa, sugar, and fabrics, while European merchants sold them gunpowder, weapons, sails, ropes, and provisions. Everything that Spain tried to monopolize passed through Port Royal. The exchange houses accepted coins from all nations, and the ingots were melted in local silversmiths to erase their origin. Transactions were so constant that the value of the pound sterling was artificially kept high compared to the rest of the English colonies. The city had become a pirate stock exchange, an international black market protected by the crown itself. With the Treaty of Madrid of 1670, Spain and England signed peace and mutually recognized their domains in the Caribbean. But in Port Royal, no one obeyed the orders to stop the attacks. The privateers simply changed their targets. Some began raiding French and Dutch ships, while others continued attacking the Spanish, claiming reprisals for old offenses. Governor Thomas Modiford pretended to be unaware of these expeditions, although he himself invested in them. In practice, Port Royal functioned as an autonomous city-state, with its own laws and an economy based on plunder. The English authorities in London benefited indirectly from its wealth, and none of their officials wished to intervene in such a profitable system. Daily life in Port Royal oscillated between abundance and violence. Sailors disembarked with pockets full of gold and emptied them in a single night. Tavern fights were constant, and sword duels were resolved in the middle of the street. Local judges, bribed or intimidated, rarely issued sentences. Retired buccaneers opened businesses or bought houses, mingling with merchants and officials. At least 5 languages were spoken, and churches competed with brothels in number and attendance. Port Royal was the mirror of the pirate world, chaotic, cosmopolitan, and extraordinarily rich. Meanwhile, in the northern Caribbean, another port began to follow a similar path. Nassau, on the island of New Providence, part of the Bahamian archipelago, was a modest enclave founded by the English in 1656. Its protected bay and proximity to the Florida Strait routes made it a strategic point to monitor the Spanish fleets departing from Havana. For decades, Nassau was little more than a fishing port, but by the late 17th century, it began to attract pirates and deserters fleeing the competition in Port Royal. When Jamaica began imposing stricter controls over piracy, Nassau became its natural successor. The port of Nassau offered what Port Royal could no longer guarantee: total freedom. There was no strong governor nor a permanent garrison. Pirates disembarked and repaired their ships without paying taxes, trading goods directly with local merchants. The small settlement gradually filled with huts, taverns, and makeshift warehouses. The privateers called it the refuge of the Brothers of the Sea. Unlike Port Royal, where gold circulated in coins, Nassau's economy was based on barter: rum for ammunition, cloth for sugar, weapons for slaves. This informality attracted mixed crews from all over Europe and Africa, creating a multiracial and multilingual pirate community that recognized no flag. Reports sent from Havana and Cartagena warned that Nassau was becoming a hub of corruption and danger. Pirates used the island as a base to attack Spanish, French, and English ships indiscriminately. The loot was sold to merchants in Boston, Charleston, and Providence, who in turn resold it in Europe. The smuggling route had become institutionalized. In just 2 decades, the Bahamas went from being a forgotten group of islands to a nerve center of Atlantic illegal trade. pirates not only dominated the sea, they controlled the economy and information. Every ship leaving Nassau carried news of fleets, military movements, and the riches traveling to Spain. The simultaneous rise of Port Royal and Nassau marked the peak of pirate influence in the Caribbean. No other region in the world concentrated so much wealth from plunder in such a short time. From both cities, attacks were coordinated, loot was divided, and alliances between captains were defined. Crews mixed and pirate codes were unified, establishing rules on discipline, compensation, and the division of profits that would influence all Atlantic bands. In taverns, they discussed routes, enemy ships, and whether or not to accept the new letters of marque offered by governors. For the first time, the Caribbean had a double pirate heart beating between Jamaica and the Bahamas. In the final years of the 17th century, Port Royal was known as the richest and wickedest city in the world. Its docks were full of ships and its streets overflowed with gold. Nassau, for its part, was preparing to welcome a new generation of pirates who would soon turn its sands into a refuge and its bay into free territory. The Caribbean had reached the highest point of its maritime anarchy, and European empires watched helplessly as their own colonies transformed into realms of freedom and violence under the black flag of plunder. The pirate code and life at sea. With the rise of Port Royal and Nassau, Caribbean piracy reached such a magnitude that it could no longer be sustained solely as an individual or spontaneous activity. Captains needed to maintain order, prevent mutinies, and ensure that each man received a fair share of the loot. From this necessity arose the Pirate Code, also called Articles of Agreement, a set of rules drafted and signed by the entire crew before embarking on a voyage. This code did not come from any European law or royal mandate. It was created by the pirates themselves and had binding force on board. Whoever violated it faced punishments ranging from the loss of their share of the loot to death. The code varied from ship to ship, but almost all contained provisions regarding the division of loot. The captain received between 1 and 2 full shares, the first mate 1.5, and the rest of the men an equal part. Surgeons, craftsmen, and pilots could receive additional fractions due to their technical importance. The goal was to avoid extreme inequalities like those existing in the regular navies of England or Spain, where sailors received miserable wages while officers enriched themselves. Among pirates, equitable distribution fostered loyalty, as each crew member knew they were fighting for a tangible reward. Another fundamental clause of the code referred to the election of the captain. Unlike state navies, where officers were appointed by the crown or by noble title, on a pirate ship the captain was chosen by majority vote. His authority in combat was absolute, but outside of it he had to submit to the will of the crew. If a captain showed cowardice, was accused of favoritism, or demonstrated strategic incompetence, he could be removed at any time. Democracy on board was strict and direct. Each pirate had the right to voice and vote on ship matters. This turned pirate vessels into floating micro-republics, governed by the law of consensus. The code also regulated personal behavior. It was forbidden to steal from a companion, desert during a fight, or hide part of the loot. Fights on board had to be resolved through controlled duels, generally on land, using unloaded pistols except for 1 bullet. If a pirate was injured in combat, the code established clear economic compensations. For the loss of a leg, 800 silver pesos were granted. For an arm, 600. For an eye or a finger, between 100 and 150. These compensations were paid from the common loot before distributing it among the members. In this way, the life and sacrifice of the fighter had an economic value accepted by all. Discipline on board was strict. Although pirates enjoyed freedoms non-existent in royal fleets, they also faced severe punishments if they broke the rules. Whoever was caught stealing from the common loot could be marooned, that is, abandoned on a deserted island with a pistol and a bullet to choose between dying of hunger or shooting themselves. Other punishments included flogging, loss of rations, or reduction of the assigned share in the division. These measures were not meant to humiliate, but to preserve the survival of the group in a hostile environment where betrayal could mean the end of all. Life on board was marked by routine and danger. The days began with the hoisting of the black or red flag, depending on the mission. Each man had an assigned post: lookout on the mainmast, gunner on the gun deck, carpenter in the hold, cook at the stern. Watches were organized in 4-hour shifts, and the punishment for falling asleep was losing the share of the loot from the next attack. Food consisted of salted meat, hard biscuits infested with weevils, rationed water, and rum mixed with lemon to prevent scurvy. Diseases were common, especially dental infections, tropical fevers, and poorly healed wounds. The surgeon, if there was one of the most respected men, for the crew's life depended on his skill. Leisure also had rules. Gambling was allowed as long as loot gold was not used. Pirates could bet clothing, tobacco, or rum. Music was common, with drums, violins, and bagpipes accompanying sailors' songs. The dead were thrown into the sea wrapped in a sail, sometimes with a last sip of rum poured in their name. Despite their fierce reputation, pirates maintained collective rituals that reinforced the sense of brotherhood. Many ships included in their code an oath of mutual loyalty, committing to rescue a captured comrade and avenge his death. The pirate code also regulated the relationship with prisoners. If an enemy ship surrendered without fighting, the crew was generally pardoned and put ashore, but if it offered resistance, pirates could execute the officers or throw them overboard. The code stated that gratuitous cruelty was unnecessary because it generated resistance in future targets. The main objective was to capture loot, not to terrorize for pleasure. However, some captains made terror a psychological strategy, like Blackbeard, who placed lit fuses under his hat to create a demonic image and achieved surrenders without firing a single shot. For many men, pirate life was preferable to servitude on state ships. In the British Navy, sailors could be recruited by force through the press gangs, compelled to serve without guaranteed pay and subjected to corporal punishment. In contrast, a pirate ship offered equality, participation in decisions, and the possibility of obtaining a fortune in a single expedition. This appeal caused many sailors to desert to join piracy, which led European crowns to consider the phenomenon a direct threat to their naval authority. The adoption of the pirate code allowed crews made up of men of diverse nationalities, languages, and religions to function as highly coordinated military units. The law of the sea they themselves created established an internal order that allowed them to challenge entire empires. The code not only regulated behavior, it was the basis of an alternative floating society where loyalty was measured in combat, courage was rewarded with gold, and authority was earned not by noble blood but by the strength of will and collective respect. The golden age of piracy. The second half of the 17th century opened an unprecedented period in the history of the Caribbean, the golden age of piracy. It was a time when the sea ceased to belong to empires and, for a brief moment, came to be dominated by men without a flag. The names Henry Morgan, Blackbeard, Charles Vane, Samuel Bellamy, Calico Jack, Anne Bonny, and Mary Red became symbols of alternative naval power outside European hierarchies. Their ships, fast and armed with light cannons, intercepted Spanish, Dutch, and English galleons alike. While the empires exhausted their resources in continental wars, pirates took advantage of the power vacuum to build a transnational network that controlled the main routes of Atlantic trade between 1650 and 1730. Henry Morgan was one of the most feared figures at the beginning of this era. From his base in Port Royal, he led expeditions against Panama, Maracaibo, and Portobello, key cities of the Spanish Empire on the mainland. Each attack increased his fortune and prestige, attracting hundreds of men to his service. His sack of Panama in 1671, carried out with a fleet of buccaneers of multiple nationalities, demonstrated that pirates could assault not only ships but entire cities. The loot obtained was so great that the price of gold in Port Royal temporarily collapsed due to oversupply. Morgan was arrested and taken to London to stand trial, but far from being condemned, he was knighted and later appointed governor of Jamaica, an example of the pragmatic use England made of piracy as a geopolitical instrument. After Morgan, a different generation emerged, less linked to European kingdoms and more inclined to live outside any law. Among them stood Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard. His imposing figure, wrapped in burning fuses, became legendary in 1717 when he captured the French ship La Concorde and transformed it into his flagship, renaming it Queen Anne's Revenge. With more than 40 cannons, it was one of the most powerful pirate ships ever built. Blackbeard sought not so much direct confrontation as psychological terror. He placed smoking fuses under his hat, to create the image of a demon risen from hell. His presence was enough for many crews to surrender without firing a single shot. He mainly operated in the Bahamas and the Atlantic coast of North America, imposing blockades and collecting tolls from merchant ships. The great historical battles and lootings. The aforementioned golden age of piracy reached its peak through a series of battles and raids that shook the foundations of colonial power in the Caribbean. Coastal cities, once secure under the banner of the Spanish Empire, became scenes of violent assaults led by captains seeking not only loot but also strategic control of ports and maritime routes. These attacks were not acts of improvised vandalism. They often involved entire fleets, alliances between pirates of different nationalities, and military logistics that rivaled those of the imperial armies themselves. The first major offensive that marked the beginning of this era was the assault on Portobello in 1668, led by Henry Morgan. Portobello, located on the Panamanian coast, was one of the main storage centers for silver coming from the Viceroyalty of Peru. To take the city, Morgan gathered about 500 buccaneers and sailed from Port Royal, Jamaica. He used light vessels that stealthily entered the bay at night. The Spanish defenses, confident in the natural strength of the port, were quickly overcome. Morgan captured the city and demanded a ransom of 100,000 pesos to prevent its destruction. For days, the pirates looted churches, warehouses, and merchants' houses. This attack demonstrated that even the most fortified plazas of the empire could fall to an organized pirate force. 3 years later, Morgan led his boldest offensive, the sack of Panama City in 1671. With more than 1,200 men, he crossed the isthmus from the Caribbean coast, facing Spanish troops along the way. The battle culminated with the capture of the city, which was set on fire during the confrontation. The loot included gold, silver, pearls, and exotic goods from the Pacific. The scale of the attack shocked Europe. Panama was considered the jewel of the empire in tierra firme, and its fall marked the peak of the buccaneers as a military force. The city's fire forced the Spanish authorities to move the capital to a new location, New Panama, farther from the coast. Another of the most significant lootings took place in Maracaibo and Gibraltar on Lake Maracaibo in 1669. Morgan and his men faced a Spanish flotilla that tried to block their exit from the lake. Using fireships and deception tactics, the pirates destroyed the Spanish vessels one by one. Chronicles recount that the buccaneers' cannons fired shrapnel made of nails, chains, and pieces of metal, causing havoc among enemy crews. Morgan escaped with a considerable loot, and his name became a symbol of invincibility in the Caribbean. Not only Spain suffered these attacks. In 1683, the French pirate Laurent de Graff led the sacking of Veracruz, the main port of the Viceroyalty of New Spain. With a fleet of 5 ships, he deceived the Spanish defenses by posing as a merchant fleet. Once inside the port, he launched a sudden attack and captured the city in a few hours. The inhabitants were taken hostage while the pirates emptied the royal warehouses. This attack, in the heart of the Gulf of Mexico, demonstrated that pirates could act with surgical precision even in heavily protected territories. Another key moment was the Battle of Ocracoke in 1718, where the legendary Blackbeard met his end. After blocking the port of Charleston and capturing several ships, Blackbeard was pursued by a flotilla sent by the governor of Virginia. The final battle was fought hand-to-hand on the deck of the Queen Anne's Revenge. Blackbeard received multiple gunshots and sword wounds before falling. His death marked a symbolic turning point. Colonial governments were beginning to take direct measures to eliminate the pirate threat. The city of Nassau in the Bahamas was also the scene of decisive confrontations. At the beginning of the 18th century, Nassau had become a pirate republic where men like Charles Vane, Calico Jack, and Benjamin Hornigold controlled the bay without state interference. In 1718, Captain Woodes Rogers was sent by England as royal governor with the mission to restore order. Rogers offered pardon to pirates who surrendered voluntarily, but Vane rejected the offer and led armed resistance. Nassau was besieged, and after several clashes, the pirates began to flee north to Florida and the Indian Ocean, marking the start of the decline of this pirate haven. Among pirate confrontations, the conflict between Charles Vane and Samuel Bellamy stands out. Both competed for control of Nassau and the capture of the most lucrative ships. Vane, more aggressive and reluctant to accept authority, was eventually deposed by his crew, who chose Bellamy as the new captain. This episode shows how even in the pirate world there were internal power struggles and how democracy on board could change the course of an entire ship. Battles were not limited to cities and main fleets. In the Caribbean, small ports such as Campeche, Trujillo, and St. Augustine were repeatedly looted. Pirates used terror tactics to provoke quick surrenders. They waved the red flag, signaling that there would be no mercy, or the black flag, signaling that a chance to surrender would be offered. These flags, loaded with symbolism, were psychological weapons that caused panic among enemy crews. Historical lootings not only generated wealth, but also altered the geopolitics of the Caribbean. Spain was forced to militarize its sea routes, build fortresses, and reorganize its fleets. France and England began to reconsider their tacit support of pirates, aware that they were no longer tools of war but threats to their own trade. The Caribbean experienced a moment of maximum tension, where every port, island, and strait could become the scene of a new pirate invasion at any time of the year. European powers against the pirates. At the beginning of the 18th century, European powers shifted from tolerating piracy to actively pursuing it. What had for decades been an instrument of economic warfare against Spain had now become a strategic problem for all empires. England, France, and the Netherlands had consolidated their colonies in the Caribbean, establishing sugar, tobacco, and indigo plantations that depended on stable maritime trade. The same pirates who had previously attacked Spanish galleons began intercepting English and French ships, directly affecting the economies that had sustained them. In 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht ended the War of the Spanish Succession. For the first time, England obtained the official right to trade legally in the Spanish Caribbean through the Asiento de Negros, controlling the slave trade in the Americas. Piracy was no longer useful. It interfered with lawful trade that generated enormous profits. Colonial governors received direct orders to capture pirates and execute their leaders. The era of privateers with letters of marque was coming to an end. Letters of marque were revoked, and former allies of imperial power were placed outside the law. England was the first to act. In 1718, it sent Captain Woodes Rogers to Nassau as royal governor with the mission of pacifying the Bahamas. Rogers offered pardon to pirates who surrendered voluntarily, but declared traitors those who persisted in raiding. Many accepted the amnesty, including Benjamin Hornigold, a former pirate captain who became a hunter of his former comrades. However, pirates such as Charles Vane and Blackbeard rejected the pardon and were pursued. Vane was captured and hanged in Jamaica, while Blackbeard fell in combat off the coast of North Carolina in 1718 after a bloody battle against ships sent by Governor Alexander Spotswood. At the same time, France also suppressed piracy. The ports of Martinique and Guadeloupe, once safe havens, began rejecting pirates and handing them over to the authorities. In the Spanish Caribbean, the Inquisition ordered exemplary punishments against any collaborator with pirates, and naval patrols increased from Veracruz, Cartagena de Indias, and Havana. The construction of fortresses such as Castillo de San Felipe in Cartagena and El Morro in Havana had a clear purpose: to prevent pirates from finding a base from which to attack treasure convoys. Public trials and executions became a spectacle meant to deter potential recruits. Gallows were raised in Port Royal, Charleston, and Boston. Pirate bodies were displayed in iron cages along the coasts as a warning. Former pirate republics were dissolved. Nassau became an English naval base. Jamaica was transformed into a commercial center of the British Empire. Maritime routes began to be permanently escorted. The golden age of piracy was coming to its end under the combined pressure of colonial armies and imperial diplomacy. The end of the golden age. Between 1718 and 1730, piracy in the Caribbean went from its peak to its virtual disappearance as an organized force. The impact of the joint military pressure from England, France, and Spain was devastating for the crews operating from Nassau, Port Royal, and Tortuga. Trade routes were fortified, merchant ships traveled escorted by war frigates, and ports began to refuse or report pirate ships. The very colonies that had prospered thanks to smuggling transformed into bases of imperial order. The fall of the main captains marked the beginning of the end. Blackbeard died in 1718. Charles Vane was captured in 1719 and hanged in Jamaica. Calico Jack Rackham was captured in 1720 and executed in Port Royal, along with most of his crew. Anne Bonny and Mary Read were also detained but temporarily saved by claiming to be pregnant. Mary would die in prison shortly after, while Anne's final fate was lost in colonial records. Samuel Bellamy had already died in 1717 after the wreck of the Whydah Galley. Within a few years, the most feared names in the Caribbean disappeared from the seas. The dissolution of Nassau as a pirate republic was decisive. With the arrival of Governor Woodes Rogers, the island was transformed into a British naval base. Rogers used former pirates as hunters of those who remained active. Between 1718 and 1725, more than 200 pirates were captured and executed in the Western Atlantic. Those who managed to escape migrated to other territories, such as the African coast, Madagascar, and the Indian Ocean, where new targets were expected. However, the same process of repression would be repeated there. The globalization of maritime trade had made piracy no longer a local matter but an international enemy. Spain, feeling that the pirate threat was diminishing, strengthened its fleet system. The construction of warships in Havana and Veracruz, combined with the creation of a safer route through the Bahama Channel, further hindered pirate activity. At the same time, the presence of the Imperial Army on the mainland prevented pirates from capturing coastal cities as they had in the previous century. Port Royal, devastated by an earthquake in 1692 and later by hurricanes and fires, lost its central role. The city was partially abandoned and replaced by Kingston, a commercial colony controlled by England and closed to piracy. By 1730, organized piracy had practically disappeared from the Caribbean. The few captains who remained active did so on small vessels, avoiding major confrontations. The sea, once dominated by black flags, began to be patrolled by imperial navies. The transition from pirate Caribbean to colonial Caribbean was complete, and the former loot republics gave way to a new economic order based on the trade of slaves, sugar, and tobacco. The myth of the buried treasure. With the collapse of piracy in the Caribbean and the execution or disappearance of its main figures, a new phenomenon began to emerge that transcended historical events: the birth of the pirate myth. Although buccaneers and privateers had operated under strict rules and rarely buried their wealth, popular imagination transformed reality into legend. Exaggerated chronicles, sailors' accounts, and pamphlets printed in London and Amsterdam began to claim that many pirates, before being captured, hid their treasures on deserted islands, sea caves, and remote Caribbean beaches. These stories, amplified by oral culture, gave rise to one of the most persistent fantasies in maritime history: the buried treasure waiting to be found. The most cited figure in these accounts was William Kidd, a Scottish captain who began as a pirate hunter with an English commission but ended up accused of becoming a pirate himself. Before his capture in 1699, it was said that he hid a huge treasure somewhere in the West Indies. Although part of the gold was found on Gardiner's Island, off the coast of New York, the rest was never found. This real event fueled the belief that other captains, such as Blackbeard or Bellamy, had buried their loot in secret places, protected with coded maps. In reality, pirates rarely accumulated large amounts for long periods. The pirate code required sharing the booty immediately after each capture, and most quickly spent their share on rum, weapons, and supplies. Treasure maps, as they have been represented in later literature, did not exist in the historical records of the time. However, rumors of mysterious islands intensified as shipwreck remains were found by fishermen or merchants. Some vessels sunk during storms contained gold from piracy or legitimate empire trade. The recovery of silver coins off the coasts of Hispaniola, Cuba, and Florida helped consolidate the idea that the Caribbean was a graveyard of submerged riches. The remains of the Whydah Galley, sunk in 1717, confirmed centuries later that some pirate fortunes had remained trapped under the waves without being claimed by any empire. 18th century literature definitively transformed the figure of the pirate into a romantic symbol. Works such as A General History of the Pirates from 1724, attributed to the enigmatic author Charles Johnson, compiled real and fictional stories of the most famous captains. This book introduced dramatic elements such as heroic speeches, hidden maps, and lost treasures. England, which had pursued pirates, began turning them into legendary characters, reflecting the transition from fear to nostalgia for an era in which ordinary men had challenged empires. The myth of buried treasure symbolized the eternal aspiration for freedom and wealth outside the law. Although Caribbean piracy ended as a historical force in the 18th century, its legends began to cross the oceans and embed themselves in collective memory, turning the reefs, deserted beaches, and sunken galleons of the Caribbean into perpetual scenes of search, mystery, and endless ambition.